So to start us off, Martin, The Breach has just published a new investigation from Ted Rutland. He's a professor at Concordia University, and his research focuses on policing. Can you just walk us through what he found in this new investigation?
Yeah, so in 2021, reports appeared in media outlets across the country with headlines like, "Most Canadians against defunding the police." And according to study, the public says, "Don't defund the police." And this was strange because, just a little bit before then, a poll from Ipsos had come out that was very widely circulated that showed that actually a majority of Canadians, including overwhelming majorities of younger people, were for defunding the police. And the other thing that was strange about this poll being reported on is that it was confidential. So Ted Rutland basically filed access to information requests, and he got back a kind of tranche of documents. And what they revealed was fascinating. Basically, according to these government documents, what they show is that the Department of Public Safety, which is headed up by former top cop Bill Blair, seems to have cooked up a manipulative poll that was basically intended to skew the results and to make it seem like support for defunding the police was actually low. And they hired a legitimate polling firm, Environics. But what was interesting is that the department, working very closely with policing partners, whose identity we don't know, but presumably it was the RCMP, basically introduced pro-police bias into the questions. There's another twist. Despite their best efforts to bias the results, what the results actually showed when a few months later the government kind of quietly released the results on their website was that Canadians were still in significant numbers supporting defunding the police. So something like 30% of Canadians, even under very skewed questions, still were for defunding. And let me give you an example of the kind of manipulation of the questions that they did. So initially, Environics was encouraging them to ask a question like, should Canada eliminate the police altogether and find a new way to address crime and safety, which is very much in keeping with, what the Defund the Police movement has put out there. But after they consulted and had the survey vetted by the government's policing partners, the actual questions that ended up being asked were more like, do you think the police should do all the things they do now to protect public safety? And it ended up being a bit of a PR coup for the government because they succeeded in having all these media outlets just amplify this message. And all in all, it's a kind of fascinating window into the government trying to manage and manipulate public opinion about this crucial question.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we see here. And Pam, I'm going to steal your work for a minute, so you might want to elaborate on this. But I remember you wrote a piece about when they did a poll about residential schools. And then 2/3 of Canadians are tired of hearing about residential schools. So with polling in general, we always see this, first of all. Well, they'll always ask these very reactionary questions and then publish this as news. Here in Nova Scotia, they were like, should the RCMP apologize to Black people for street checks? And a majority of people were like, no, and then that somehow becomes news. It's news that people are racist or whatever. So the very idea of polling becoming news is a problem in itself, right? This idea that we go and ask what Desmond Cole has called the angry white majority, these questions. They would never ask Indigenous people, are you tired of hearing about white people? And if you did say yes, then it would be a panic, right? Oh my God, what are we going to do about these Indigenous people? What it shows us is this is so important to them, this PR move. If Canadians are oh, we might want to change policing, they will do everything they can in concert with government to lie to us, to manipulate results, to coerce the public, whatever they have to do, because they understand that so much of what they do, if we actually look at what police do on an evidence base, then everybody's they should be defunding. When you start talking to people and you actually ask people, well, do you think the cops are appropriate to intervene in mental health? Nobody thinks they are. So if you create questions like, do you want murderers running our society, yes or no? Then you're just manipulating public opinion and then saying, oh, look, people support policing, which is really just about supporting the status quo, supporting authority, and, being scared of the so-called woke mob that's going to destabilize everything about society. So Yeah, and I think it just really shows us that, as we always say, policing isn't about policing. It's not about crime. It's not about contact with cops. It's not about keeping our communities safe. It's about these structures of power and people that will hold on to them at any cost, including controlling the public narrative.
I totally agree. And the thing about it is that none of this is new. So the Auditor General actually did a review of all of these civil suits against the RCMP. And what she found at the end of it was that the RCMP put more money and energy into protecting their image than they do about addressing any of the problems in the RCMP, including those who are doing abuse. And that at that time, none of the abusers in the RCMP were ever dealt with. All the attention is on how does the RCMP look, communications, community relations, all of that stuff, instead of addressing the really, really big issues. And I think this survey is very, very problematic, obviously because it's introducing bias, but also because Environics is a group that does a lot of surveys. And I know that, survey groups want to work with governments or whatever, but really, do you really want to compromise your ethics by changing the questions that you thought were a little bit more objective or neutral? And kind of fall into this police bias trap. And it just reminds me of one of the surveys that wasn't long ago, not just the residential school one, but there was another one, which was asking Canadians, should we implement treaty rights? That's like asking Canadians, should we follow the law? It's actually constitutional law. The treaties are protected in law. But do you like your constitution? I mean, it's just, you're presenting Canadians with options about whether or not they can breach human rights. And it's just so fundamentally flawed that it doesn't actually inform you of anything. And when there's no options on these kinds of surveys, then what are they supposed to say? So you've got that, that issue, the whole propaganda thing, you've got this problematic survey, but then you also have ethics and integrity in the media. Is the media supposed to cite a survey unseen? Is that integrity? I would never speak to a survey that I haven't actually read or saw the conclusions. When you're referencing someone who references someone else, then you're not really reporting at that point. You're just commenting on what someone else said. And so I think we have to really bring media back to integrity and fact base, because we're already facing a real challenge with all of the fake news and social media manipulation and those news stations that aren't news stations, they're entertainment, but they act like news stations. So there's a lot of confusion for the general public. And I think we just actually need to go back to having some semblance of integrity, fact checking, and making sure you actually read it. Because I understand the government posted the survey months later, but the damage is done. No one's going to care. No one's going to look for that. It's all of that damage was done months earlier. And you can't guarantee that anyone would say, oh, that was wrong all way back then. So we're doing Canadians a disservice when we don't demand better in media.
I also just want to add, as you said, it's not new in academia either, right? So criminology departments, which are now changing, like there's a whole stream of radical criminologists, but for a long time, criminology was more or less a department that would collude with cops in prisons, right? So the punishment industry you wouldn't get through ethics if you weren't supported by a prison, if you wanted to do prison research. If you wanted to research stuff on policing, you couldn't possibly do it because if it wasn't something the cops wanted to see, you wouldn't get clearance and they wouldn't participate. So we've seen this for a long time, where, for example, in Canada, for a long time, we had research that said that solitary confinement did not affect people because they were using researchers that CSC was paying to then say, okay, no, solitary confinement isn't affecting people. And this is in Michael Jackson's book, Punishment Behind Walls, where he's talking to people in solitary confinement, and then, CSC is bringing in other people. So this whole industry of prisons and punishment is held up by this constant manipulation of research, manipulation of surveys, polls, academic departments, whatever it is, to install themselves and then claim that this is just common sense or evidence or fact. But then when you start digging deeper, it's all manipulated. And as Pam said, it's all essentially fake news. And if you have to lie to the public about yourself, then that suggests that you should defund yourself. Because if you can stand on the facts, if you need to lie about what you do, then you're doing something wrong. And that's why we want to defund you. So thanks for proving our point.
Defund yourself.
Defund yourself.
A new twist on canceling yourself. It's so interesting how you've both mentioned the way that all these institutions kind of work in tandem to advance, propaganda, to use that term. The media, academia, the government, the police, all kind of joining hands. And in this particular case, in the piece, Bill Blair is a chief player here, and so he's the public safety minister, obviously, and the former chief of police in Toronto. And I want to play a clip from an interview that was done with him 2 years ago, getting him to respond to the growing popularity of defund the police. And here's what he said:
"It's not a zero-sum discussion. That every part of the country also deserves professional and culturally competent, accountable policing services. But every part of the country also needs to ensure that we address those social conditions that give rise to injustice, that give rise to disparate outcomes, that cause people to suffer. And so the work of supporting Canadians in every part of our country, and particularly racialized Canadians, Indigenous Canadians and racialized Canadians in all parts of this country, we need to do a better job of providing them support and helping their kids be successful, their communities be safer, and we have to ensure that the police that are there to serve and protect them are culturally competent, capable, professional, and accountable in how they perform those duties."
Martin, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, as a politician, Bill Blair has clearly improved his skills, rhetorical skills at least, since the G20 days when he called protesters in the streets terrorists and criminals. Clearly, cops are updating their script now, and they're trying to absorb, at least in rhetoric, what police critics and the Defund the Police movement is saying. But of course, he's literally wrong. It is exactly a zero-sum scenario because we need to divest the police of power and resources in order to redirect them to actually life-affirming services. And so the cops can't have their cake and eat it too. They're going to have to give something up. But this is, to me, an interesting, this is the trend that the federal government certainly is moving towards, in as much as possible managing public opinion, whether by, deliberately manipulating polls or just, shape-shifting in terms of the rhetoric they use to make it seem like they too are changing.
I feel like he was about to rip his shirt off and there would be a thin blue line, t-shirt underneath, you know what I mean? Do you think there were enough Canadian flags behind him? I don't think there's enough. Oh. And one day they're just going to have the police dogs give the briefings, the puppies. They'll be this new puppy is going to give the briefing. And then, because they'll do anything to get our affection. But yeah, every time I look at Bill Blair, I just think he's going to be whoosh, and it's thin blue line underneath.
And he's just so detached from reality, even saying or implying that, yes, of course, police need to improve their services. It's so beyond that. We know police have never improved their services. In fact, it just gets worse on many fronts all across the country. And, not just here, but also in the United States. So what is he even talking about? For him to think that he's going to fool most Canadians when, a couple of nice words at a press conference really doesn't mean anything. When you see police beating people in the streets, when you see RCMP officers beating and assaulting an unarmed chief from a First Nation on video, and for the RCMP to say, well, we won't stand for that in police, RCMP culture. What do you mean? That is RCMP culture. And that's why those cops were cleared originally. The only reason why it became an issue afterwards is because we saw the video. And so they're competing with something that they have not been able to control. In the past, they were able to control all of the mainstream media when we didn't have the proliferation of social media. It's basically media just read the cops' speaking notes and press releases. And in many cases, they still do that in some provinces and areas. But now they can't control the message because people see, people hear, we're able to share our critique, we're able to provide the facts and stats. And so I think although he's trying to, put on a very good face about policing, I think he fails miserably.